What's up, guys? Do you see this? This freaking thing is huge. There's a big, don't mind that, please. You know what? Let's get on to the topic for today. What's good, creatives? Welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk to you about exposure triangle, which consists of three things. 1, shutter speed, 2, aperture, and 3, ISO. And these are three major components to getting the right exposure when you're trying to expose for an image or a video. So let's jump right into the first one, shutter speed. So boom, when it comes down to shutter speed, if you're doing a video, you want to have your shutter speed double your frame rate always. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be double that, which will be 48. But typically in most DSLR cameras, you can only get to 50. So you would want to shoot at 50 for a natural motion blur cinema look. Now, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second because you want to get slow-mo, then you would have to bump it double that, 120. But we don't have 120 in most DSLRs, it goes to 125. So you would put it at 125 on the shutter speed. And then for those of you who have 120 frames per second, lucky people you want to double that. So you want to go to 250 on the shutter speed, typically with a DSLR camera if you're shooting at 120 frames per second. And that's just going to make all the settings go smooth and make your video smooth and buttery. Now, what the shutter speed does when you adjust it, the higher you take your shutter speed, the more edgy your camera is going to be, the more things are going to be moving really fast. And if you're shooting handheld, you might see a little bit more of a jitter and handshakes because it's just an intense setting. When you put your shutter speed up, it's going to give more intense movements. Now, when you lower your shutter speed, it's going to be more of a motion blur, more smooth type of vibe. So if you're trying to do something handheld and you don't want a bunch of shakes, then you might want to shoot with a lower shutter speed. Maybe you are handheld, but you know that the song that you're shooting for a music video or whatever the footage that you're shooting, you want it to be intense and rough, action-packed and fast-paced, then you might want to crank your shutter speed up. Now, the only thing when you're adjusting your shutter speed on the flip side is the higher you go, the darker it's going to make your image. The lower you go, the brighter it's going to make your image. So it's all about balance. You're going to have to try to adjust that shutter speed according to your other two settings, aperture and ISO, so that everything works out right. So on the other side, if you're doing photos, if you're shooting something that's sitting still, or maybe you're holding something in your hand and it's not moving a lot, you can drop your shutter speed down according to your other settings, aperture and ISO, to balance it out right. Now, if you're trying to take a photo of something in action, let's say like sports, Johnny Zodic, come on, dude. I'm gonna have to call you back, bro. Graphic designer talk. Yeah, not right now. Like I said, in action, if you're shooting somebody running around or playing basketball, or maybe you're doing behind the scenes for somebody at a music video and everybody's moving a lot, you're gonna wanna crank your shutter speed up. The higher your shutter speed is when you're taking photos, the more you'll catch in action. There won't be a lot of motion blur and people's hands blurred out and stuff like that. Everything will be in focus the higher your shutter goes. And obviously, like I said before, it's all about balancing it with your aperture and your ISO to make the image the right exposure and to get the right look. So moving on, let's talk about number 2, aperture. Oh, I love aperture because I'm one of those people who loves bokeh. I love bokeh. I love taking pictures of my hand all the time, holding something and everything in the background being bokeh out, which would lead to you using a lower aperture. I don't know if it's like, I think they say it's like higher for a lower number. I'm not exactly sure, but in this video, we're gonna say a lower aperture would be 1.4, 1.8, and a higher aperture would be 4.0 and up. I think technically it's the other way around, but who wants to do everything by the books, man? Let's be creative. Let's do it how we want to do it. So with a lower aperture, a 1.4 or 1.8, you're gonna have the background blurred out. There's gonna be a lot more depth and it's gonna be focused in on one subject, real shallow depth of field, and you're not gonna be able to focus on everything. So on the flip side, if you take your aperture higher, maybe a 4.0 and up, there's gonna be less depth of field, more is gonna be in focus in your picture. So let's say if I'm taking a picture of a landscape, I want all these different things to be in focus. I might shoot with a higher aperture. On the flip side, if I'm out and I'm holding something in my hand, maybe I'm holding a camera and I want to take a picture holding that camera and I want all the lights and cars behind it to be bokeh out, I'm going to drop my aperture down to maybe a 1.8, 1.4, or a 1.2 if my lens is available to do that. Let's jump back and talk about video. It's the same concept though. Just like before with the shutter speed, aperture is the same when it comes to taking it lower or higher. When you have your aperture set at a 1.4 or 1.8, it's obviously going to be more light coming in. So you could say a lens with a low aperture would work best in like low light situations because you can get more light out of your camera without boosting your third setting, ISO. So there's really no rules to it. Like with shutter speed, you got to double your frame rate. You don't have to have any rules with your aperture. The only thing is the lower you go, 1.4, the brighter you can get your picture. The higher you go, 4.0 and up, the darker it's going to make your picture. And lower with a 1.4, you're going to get more depth of field so you can focus in on something and everything else be creamy, bokeh out and blurred out. And 4.0 and up, you're going to get more in focus. You can take a picture of somebody standing here with stuff behind them and everything be in focus with a higher higher aperture. Me, I love bokeh. I love going low, and I like capturing the subject and having everything else bokeh out. That's just my favorite, even sometimes in videos. But pro tip, if you're shooting videos and you're using autofocus and you're like on a gimbal or a glide camera or something, and you're trying to keep focus on a subject, you might want to use a little bit of a higher aperture. That's just a pro tip right there. We're moving along right now, but I hope that I'm explaining this the easiest way, less complicated, so you guys can understand this. I really hope that this is going easy for you and you're kind of learning. So on to the third element of exposure triangle, ISO. ISO is the least of your worries. It is the one that doesn't really affect the style of your video or your photo. The only thing that it affects is the light. It is light sensitivity. The ISO is your camera's light sensitivity. So the lower you bring your ISO, the darker it will make your image. The higher you push your ISO, the more brighter it will make your image. Only thing, the higher you go with ISO, the more you are opening your camera up to having grain in the shot. You want to always keep your ISO as low as possible. Any camera, I like to say, rule of thumb, do not go over 800 ISO. But there's plenty of times where I have and I do, and it still looks pretty good. It just depends on the camera that you're using. Cheaper cameras tend to not do so well with higher ISO. The more expensive cameras can push the ISO a little bit further. Like this camera, the 1DX Mark II, you can push the ISO a lot higher and still get a good image. But that doesn't mean do not try to keep the ISO as low as possible. Always try to keep your ISO as low as possible. So how I like to set my camera when it comes time to shoot, depending on the scenario, there's so many different scenarios that I can name. I try to just drop my ISO down to 100, set my shutter for whatever it is that I'm trying to shoot, set my aperture to how I want it to look, and then I'll push my ISO if I need to bring the brightness of the image up. I hope that made sense. It made sense when I was thinking it and said it. I hope this is making sense. I've been trying to make this video for so long, and this is why I haven't made it yet, because it's kind of difficult to explain. I think that everything I'm saying is going to make a lot of sense to you guys, especially the people that are beginning and starting out. I think this is really going to help. I personally had the toughest time learning the exposure triangle, like aperture and shutter speed, trying to balance them together for the shot that I'm looking for. It was so hard for me to kind of understand and get down pat. Luckily, I had my good friend YC Imaging to help me out with that. He got it really fast. He was like an early learner with that, but I eventually learned it, and once I did, everything was amazing from that point on. So I know there's a ton of different scenarios out there where you would have to set your camera settings differently, but we're going to talk about a few right here. So number one, let's say you want a picture of a subject and you want the background bokeh out, but your subject is moving really fast. You're obviously going to want a lower aperture because you want things to be bokeh out, and you're going to want a higher shutter speed because you want to capture this subject that's moving fast without getting motion blur in it. You want it to be a nice crisp image in action. So that's how you would capture that. Let's talk about the next one. Number two, you just want a simple picture for your Instagram or your IG story, or just to have, maybe you want to print it on a canvas of just your hand holding something out, and you want the background bokeh out. So there you would want your aperture to be low, therefore your background will be bokeh out and you could focus strictly on your hand. For that one, your shutter speed wouldn't really matter because it's something sitting still. Your hand will be still, it's not going to be moving that much, so you can just go with the average shutter speed. Me, maybe I'd go with just like 100, 125. All right, cool. Let's talk about the next one. Number three, you're shooting a low light music video and you don't have much light at all. You're going to want to use the lens that you have the lowest aperture on. You want to drop down to a 1.8, 1.4, 1.2, just so you can get as much light in your camera as possible without having much light around you. And you're also going to want to shoot with a low shutter speed just so you can obviously have as much light as possible. If you do have a little bit of light, you might be able to put your shutter speed up a little bit just to make it a little bit more intense with the movements. But for the most part, if you're shooting a music video in low light and you don't have much light at all, you're going to want to use the lens with the lowest aperture that you can. Drop that aperture down, drop your shutter speed down to the lowest you can go. With that being said, it has to double the frame rate. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second, the lowest you could go is 48, DSLR 50, and that would be how I set my settings for that scenario. All right, let's talk about the last one. Number four, you're shooting a music video outside on a gray day. So the gray day gives you like a soft light, so it's like perfect lighting, and you're gonna want some intense movements because the song that you're shooting the music video for is really hype and fast paced, and you just want them to be jumping around really intense. Now your aperture, it wouldn't really matter. It would be according to the look you want. If you want the background to be blurry, you'd obviously drop your aperture down. If you have a nice background and you want your subject and the background all to be in focus, you might want to boost your aperture up. Now the key factor here is shutter speed, because if you want intense movements, then you're gonna have to boost your shutter speed higher. Maybe it gets a little dark when you boost your shutter speed up, so you want to drop your aperture back down a little bit, which could cause a little bit of depth and some blur in the background, but for the most part, you got your image. So yeah, those four examples are just examples that I made up and maybe how I would set my camera settings for those scenarios, and hopefully that helps you out a little bit. So boom, there it is, man. Exposure triangle is based on 3 settings. Shutter speed, which the higher you go, the more faster it is. The lower your shutter speed is, the more motion blur you have and the more smooth your video is. 2, aperture. The lower you go, 1.8, 1.4. You're gonna be focused in on one subject, and the stuff behind your subject is gonna be bulked out real creamy and blurry. You won't be able to see it or even tell kind of what you're at. Maybe if there's lights behind it, it'll be awesome looking. The higher the aperture, then it'll be way less depth and everything will be in focus. And last but not least, ISO, light sensitivity. The higher you boost it, the more brighter your image will get, but you potentially could get grain. The lower you bring your ISO, the darker it'll make your image and the more crispier and clear it will make it. Boom! I hope that helped you, man. So glad that I finally got this video done. I am so glad that we are got this out, and y'all can learn from this, man. I had the hardest time when I was getting started trying to learn this stuff, exposure triangle to make my picture perfectly exposed. I don't even know, man. I'm glad that I got this video out the way, and I really hope that this video helps you. If it does help you, please make sure to smash the like button, share this video for other creatives to peep, and drop me a comment if you can, and let me know if I explain this clearly, if it helped you out, and let me know which setting is hardest for you, which one you don't really understand that much, and maybe we'll dive deeper into it and do some testing and go out and test the scenarios with that actual setting. Consider subscribing, man, and I'll see you guys next video. Peace.